There are moments in life that divide everything into a before and an after. Moments you don't choose, that don't announce their arrival, that show up on a regular Tuesday smelling of engine oil with the sound of a radio playing in the background. You're doing exactly what you've always done. Your hands in the right place, your body in the right place, and then something happens, too small to have a name, too big to be ignored, and you're never the same again. This is the story of Rodrigo Santos, 34 years old, mechanic, owner of an auto shop in downtown Guarulhos, on the outskirts of São Paulo, which he inherited from his father and keeps running with the same quiet stubbornness he applies to everything in his life. Dark skin, broad shoulders, closely cropped hair with the first grey strands at the temples that he hasn't yet decided whether to embrace or fight. Hands that never get completely clean, no matter how many times he washes them. Greece has its own roots, and Rodrigo learned a long time ago to stop fighting against what won't wash away. This isn't a story about what he expected. This is a story about what he discovered, and it begins exactly like all stories that change us, on a day when you weren't looking for anything. Tuesday began at 6:42 when the alarm went off and Rodrigo shut it down before the second ring, just like always. Not because he was disciplined in the way people romanticize in motivational stories, it was because the silence of the house, when he was awake, was more tolerable than when he tried to ignore it. The silence of the house had been a new thing for the past 6 months. Before, there was the background noise of someone existing in the same space, the television in the next room, water running in the kitchen, the diffuse presence of another person who didn't need to be visible to be felt. You get used to those sounds without realizing it, and only notice when they're gone. 6 months. That was the time since Carla had left with 2 suitcases, a lamp that was hers from before, and the same sentence he had already heard in other ways from other mouths over the years. You're always here, but you're never truly present. He hadn't argued. He had helped carry the bags to her car, gone back inside, washed the dinner dishes left in the sink, and gone to sleep. The next day, he opened the shop on time. What Rodrigo hadn't done in any of the 6 months that followed was think much about it. Not in the way people think when they're mourning a relationship, with that ache that fills the chest and demands attention. What he expected to feel and knew he was supposed to feel was a loss. Carla had been 4 years. 4 years was enough time to grow roots into things, to feel the emptiness of something when it walked away. But the emptiness was different from what he had anticipated. It was quieter, easier to manage, and that was, if he was being honest, the part that bothered him the most. Not the pain of the absence, but the soft question the absence left behind. If the loss was so manageable, what did that say about what had been there to begin with? It was more like a low-frequency nuisance, an interference signal he picked up sometimes when the house got too quiet and he had nothing left to do with his hands. He didn't have a name for it, nor did he try to find one. The shop was on a moderately busy street, flanked by a small grocery store on one side and a junkyard on the other, with a bar across the street that served the best cod fritters in the neighborhood and the coldest beer Rodrigo knew of within a 10-kilometer radius. The building was made of concrete with 2 hydraulic lifts, neon lighting that buzzed faintly in the summer heat, and walls covered in an inventory of calendars, technical notes, and a whiteboard where Nico Alves, senior mechanic, informal partner, childhood friend, logged the day's jobs in a handwriting that no one but Rodrigo could fully decipher. Nico had arrived at 7:15, as always, with a bag of bread in his left hand and coffee in a thermos that he guarded as if it was something sacred. 100 pounds of personality packed into a 200-pound body, with a laugh that carried down the entire street and a fully formed opinion about absolutely everything all the time. "It's gonna be a heavy day," Nico announced as he walked in, tossing the bread onto the back table without ceremony. "I felt it in my knee." "Your knee gets its predictions wrong 50% of the time," Rodrigo said without turning around. "It's better than 50%. "No, it's not." That was their rhythm. It had been that way since they were 16, when Rodrigo was still helping his dad on Saturday afternoons, and Nico would show up because he didn't have anything better to do. 20 years of repetition until the repetition became comfort itself. There was a specific kind of stability to that kind of life. Not the stability of someone who hasn't faced challenges, but the stability of someone who found a rhythm early on and never had a good enough reason to question it. His father had built the shop. Rodrigo had inherited and expanded it. Nico had stayed. Customers kept coming back. The customers' kids would bring their own cars when they grew up, and the street had changed around them. But the concrete building with the 2 hydraulic lifts had remained the same. It was a life that made sense when you were inside it. Most lives do. The TV high on the wall showed sports news with the volume low enough to be background noise without being a distraction. Rodrigo worked on the first job of the day, a brake inspection on a Palio that had arrived on Monday with the mechanical concentration that was his favorite way of existing. Hands busy, mind quiet, a problem with a clear solution. Manual labor had this quality that intellectual work rarely did, a concrete and verifiable result. The brakes were bad. You did the work, the brakes were good. There was no ambiguity. There was no intermediate state that required interpretation. It was almost 10 in the morning when he heard the sound. Rodrigo recognized it before he even saw the car. It was a specific noise coming from the engine. Not the dry knock of a rod, not the squeal of a belt, but something in between. An irregular hum with a fluctuating pitch that clearly said the engine was working against a blockage that shouldn't be there. He stood up before he even thought about it. He climbed out of the inspection pit, wiped his hands on the rag he kept in his back pocket, and walked to the entrance. The car was a silver Civic, probably a 2018, in good overall condition except for the sound it was making as it pulled up. The driver got out quickly, slammed the door with the urgency of someone who had been running late for a long time, and shot Rodrigo a look with an expression that mixed relief with the specific frustration of someone who just realized their entire day is going down the drain. Rodrigo sized him up in a second, with the clinical eye he had developed over years of customer service, 30 years old, maybe a little less. Slightly long curly hair, not styled but not neglected either, the kind who lets it grow and forgets about it, not the kind who lets it grow out of laziness. A grey t-shirt, jeans, sneakers that had once been expensive and had walked many sidewalks since. Shoulders narrower than Rodrigo's, but a way of taking up space that wasn't small relaxed maybe. Like someone who wasn't used to having to justify where he was. "This engine's been complaining for about 3 days now," the man said, approaching with his hand extended. "Lucas Ferreira." "Rodrigo." A firm handshake from both sides. 3 days with that noise and you kept driving?" "I live in Guarulhos and work in São Paulo. Stopping wasn't an option." "It is now." Rodrigo turned toward the car, popped the hood. Lucas popped it. Rodrigo leaned over the engine and let the diagnosis begin the way he always did. First the ears, then the eyes, then the hands. The hum was clearer up close, with a variation that indicated irregular pressure on the timing chain. Possible tensioner, possible water pump starting to wear out. It needed more investigation to confirm. He reached out to examine the tensioner up close, his left hand supporting his body weight against the side of the engine. And Lucas Ferreira's hand was in the exact same spot, at the exact same moment, for the exact same reason. The contact lasted maybe a second and a half, 2 at most. Rodrigo didn't move immediately. That was the detail that would stick with him later. Not the touch itself, but the split second where neither of them pulled away. Lucas turned his head. Rodrigo was looking at the engine, but he felt the stare. Then he stepped back, a little too quickly, grabbed the tensioner and forced his concentration back to the diagnosis. "The car needs at least a day," he said, and his voice came out drier than he intended. "I'll need to look into it better, but I suspect the timing chain tensioner. If it's that, plus the general tune-up this engine is asking for, you'll be without it at least until tomorrow." Lucas had a dark smudge on his forearm, a thin streak of engine grease left by the contact just seconds before. He hadn't noticed. Rodrigo noticed. "Tomorrow." Lucas nodded, with no sign that that split second between them had ever existed. "All right. Is there a coffee shop around here?" "In the waiting room. There's a place with Wi-Fi on the corner too, if you need to work. I'll just use my laptop. I'm a freelance designer." A short pause. "I appreciate it." Rodrigo didn't answer. He turned back to the engine with a level of attention that, had Nico been looking closely, would have seemed excessive for the situation. But Nico wasn't looking closely. Nico was finishing his coffee. Rodrigo's own engine was also working against some blockage that shouldn't be there. He stayed leaned over the Civic for longer than the diagnosis required. His hands did the work, checking the chain, testing the pressure, making mental notes of what needed testing, but some part of his attention was caught on that second and a half, like a snagged nail on fabric. He pulled at it. It stayed caught. It was nothing. It was the kind of thing that happened in a mechanic shop all the time, tight spaces, two pairs of hands trying to check the same part. It was so mundane that it didn't even deserve the mental file he was accidentally opening up to store it in. Rodrigo closed the file. He went to work. That was the thing. He had been closing files his entire life. It was a skill he had developed with the same methodical precision with which he had developed all his others. Diagnosing by sound before popping the hood, estimating times without needing to calculate, knowing how to warn a customer about a cost doubling without making them feel ripped off. Closing files was part of the toolkit. You notice, you catalog, you discard. Life goes on. The problem was that this file kept reopening itself. Nico showed up around 11, holding a screw and the topic of the day. An amateur weekend football tournament where his team was, according to Nico, finally going to prove their worth. Rodrigo responded at the right pace, in the right places, with just the right amount of skepticism about Nico's team's prospects, which was a ritual as familiar as washing your hands before lunch. You could answer without thinking because the responses were already hardwired, calibrated by 20 years of repetition, available like tools hanging on a pegboard. Then Nico glanced toward the waiting room. A quick, casual look, followed by a muttered comment and a little chuckle. The kind of comment Rodrigo had heard his whole life in locker rooms, bars, the back of construction sites, and exactly in this repair shop. Something about the way Lucas was sitting. Something with the tone men use when they want to communicate something without saying it out loud. The kind of thing that leaves no trace because it's too mundane to leave a trace. Rodrigo laughed. The sound came out automatically, calibrated for that kind of comment, the same way a knee-jerk reflex happens when someone taps the exact right spot. And then, a fraction of a second later, just enough time for Nico to have already turned his back, Rodrigo heard his own laugh echoing in an unusual way. It wasn't the substance of the laugh, it was the mechanics. The laugh had slipped out before he decided to laugh. It had come from that place where the pre-recorded answers are stored. From that repository of behaviors you no longer choose because you've triggered them so many times they've become automatic. And Rodrigo, who had never paid attention to this repository, who had lived inside it as if it were the walls and not the room itself, was suddenly standing on the outside looking at it. It took a second. Less. Nico was talking about the championship again. He went back to the engine. He didn't think about it anymore. Or he tried not to think about it. He succeeded for the most part until the mechanical work was done and there was no more engine occupying his hands and attention. Around 12:30, the diagnosis was confirmed. Timing chain tensioner with advanced wear, water pump showing the first signs of failure, plus a small leak in the manifold that was better to fix now than leave for later. The main part needed to be ordered. It would arrive by late afternoon at best. The car would definitely have to stay until the next day. Rodrigo went to let Lucas know. The waiting room was small, with 3 blue plastic chairs, a TV smaller than the one in the shop playing a muted cooking show, and a corner table with coffee that had been keeping warm since 7. Lucas was in one of the chairs with his laptop on a side table, his headphones pulled down around his neck, not covering his ears, the sign of someone who was working but not closed off, a sign of someone who had learned to navigate the world without shutting themselves away from it. Rodrigo explained the diagnosis, the parts, the time frame, the estimated cost. Lucas listened with the quality of attention of someone who genuinely listens, not with the expression of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but with the silence of someone who is actually processing. He asked 2 precise technical questions that showed he didn't understand mechanics but understood budgets and not getting ripped off, and he agreed to the service. "Is there any good place to eat around here?" Lucas asked while Rodrigo jotted down the estimate. "There's a restaurant on the next street. Decent set meals." Rodrigo typed on the calculator, "Or the bar across the street if you want something lighter." "I prefer lighter, thanks." Rodrigo left. He had already half turned around when Lucas said, with no particular urgency, "This tensioner thing, How many times have you seen it fail like this on this generation of Civic? Rodrigo stopped, turned, answered. It was a legitimate question, and the answer was technical. Hydraulic tensioners on this generation of Civic had a predictable wear rate when oil changes were delayed. Most owners ignored the deadlines, out of ignorance or to save money, and ended up in the shop with the engine making exactly that sound. It was a story Rodrigo had told dozens of times, but Lucas listened with the expression of someone hearing it for the first time, and that made the story be told in a slightly different way, with more care, with more precision than usual. They spent 3 minutes longer than strictly necessary on that conversation. Rodrigo only noticed when he went back to the engine and looked at the clock. Back to work, he didn't open the file again. He just worked. But when Nico asked at 2 in the afternoon if the Civic was going to stay for the next day, Rodrigo said yes and didn't explain why it was taking longer than estimated to confirm the time estimate. The end of the workday arrived like it always does, gradually and then all at once. Nico left first, with his toolkit over his shoulder and a theory about Saturday's championship match. Rodrigo closed the front gate, leaving the back gate only slightly ajar while he finished logging the day in the system. When he stepped out, Lucas was on the sidewalk. He wasn't waiting for him, or at least that was the cleanest read Rodrigo could make of it. Lucas was simply on the sidewalk with his laptop in his backpack, his phone in his hand, wearing the expression of someone deciding whether to call an Uber or try to figure out what the neighborhood has to offer. "The bar across the street has good food," Rodrigo said, without really knowing why he was saying it. Lucas looked toward the bar. "Is that what you're going to do?" Rodrigo looked at the bar too. Probably. It wasn't a decision. It was the opposite of a decision. It was the absence of one, the moment you slip into where things are heading because there's no specific reason to go the other way. They crossed the street together. The bar was the kind that exists in every working-class neighborhood in São Paulo. Low marble tables, bar stools with upholstery that had seen better days, a TV in the corner showing soccer in silence, the smell of fried food and beer that was the smell of conversation and time passing. The owner, a woman in her 50s with short hair and a yellow apron, knew Rodrigo by his order. They sat down. Rodrigo ordered a beer and chicken strips. Lucas ordered the same beer and looked at the menu like someone who makes genuine, non-performative decisions. He still had the grease stain on his forearm. He still hadn't noticed. The conversation started in safe territory: the car, the deadline, the costs, the logic of fixing it now versus letting it get worse. Lucas talked about how he had bought the Civic second-hand and had never been able to get the hang of preventive maintenance because there was always something more urgent eating up the same money. Rodrigo knew that logic. It was the logic of every customer who showed up with their car in critical condition and the look of someone who knew they had let it go for too long. Then the conversation drifted. It wasn't an abrupt shift. It was the way conversations drift when two adults are drinking beer at the end of a long day, and neither has a specific reason to stay on the surface. Lucas talked about work. Freelance design, specializing in visual identity for small and medium-sized businesses. The kind of work that paid well when it paid and was completely unpredictable when it didn't. He had lived in 3 cities in the last 10 years. Belo Horizonte, Porto Alegre, São Paulo. Guarulhos had been a deliberate choice after São Paulo. Cheaper, more space, less of the feeling that the city was swallowing you whole. "You chose to stay here," Rodrigo said. It wasn't a question. "A specific moment," Lucas said. "I woke up on a Monday morning in São Paulo and realized I wasn't living there. I was just passing through São Paulo while waiting for something to happen. I decided to go somewhere and actually live." There was something about the way he said that, "actually live," that stuck with Rodrigo for a second longer than usual. He had lived in Guarulhos his entire life. He had been born 4 kilometers from the shop. He had gone to school 2 kilometers away. He had married, divorced, stayed by his father's side until the end, and taken over the business all within the same geographic radius as always. By every objective definition of the term, he had lived in Guarulhos for 34 years. But when Lucas said, "actually live," Rodrigo had the uncomfortable feeling that he knew exactly what Lucas meant, and that he wasn't sure if he had ever done it himself. Rodrigo knew that feeling. Not in the way Lucas described it. He had never lived anywhere but Guarulhos. But the core of it, the difference between occupying a space and actually being in it. He talked about the auto shop, about his father, who had built the place from the ground up in the 80s, who smelled of grease when he died, and who would have found any discussion about this ridiculous, about what it meant to inherit something, not just the building, not just the equipment, but the specific shape it required you to take. Antonio Santos's shop had a reputation, and that reputation had a profile, and since he was 18, Rodrigo had learned to be the person that reputation needed. Lucas listened without rushing, without the reflex to offer advice or a counterexample or a clever observation to show he was following along. There was something unsettling about that way of listening, not because it was invasive, but because it left nowhere for Rodrigo to hide behind how the story was told. When you're narrating to someone who processes instead of reacting, the performance space vanishes, and all that's left is the naked truth. "And did you want to be that person?" Lucas asked. It was a simple question, the kind people ask without realizing the weight of what they're carrying. "I never asked myself that," Rodrigo said, and it was the honest answer. His phone buzzed. Rodrigo looked at the name on the screen, Donna Cleide. "Sorry," he said, and picked up. His mother's voice was the way his mother's voice always was. Warm, slightly anxious, with a fixed repertoire she went through every week, with the consistency of someone who believes repetition is a form of care. "How are you? Are you eating right? How's the shop?" Rodrigo answered in the right rhythm, the right tone, with the right inflections for each question. "Yes, Mom, I'm fine. Yes, I'm eating. The shop is good." Then came the usual question. She knew Carla had left. It had been 6 months. But Donna Cleide had a persistent faith in the inevitability of the things she considered right, and her vision of what was right included her 34-year-old son, with a suitable partner and the promise of grandchildren on the horizon. "You're not going to be alone forever, Rodrigo. You're a good man. When you decide to find a nice girl—" "Mom," he said in his usual tone, "I'm still working. I'll call you on Sunday, okay?" She said okay, said she had made canjica and would save a container for him, said she missed him. Rodrigo said he missed her too. He ended the call, he put the phone back on the table. Lucas was looking at his beer with the concentration of someone who was purposely not looking at anything else. The silence lasted for a time that Rodrigo didn't measure, but felt. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that exists when two people realize at the same time that they are sharing something neither of them has named. Rodrigo picked up his beer, took a sip, put it back down. "My mother," he said unnecessarily. "I heard," Lucas said. Simple, no irony, no judgment, avoiding the trap of making a clever remark about the obvious. They kept talking. Lucas asked about the history of the auto shop, when his father had started it, what the neighborhood was like in the 80s, what had changed and what had stayed the same. It was the conversation of someone with a genuine interest in things that lasted. Rodrigo answered in more detail than he normally would, because there was something about the quality of Lucas's attention that made the stories easier to tell than usual. But the temperature at the table had shifted, and neither of them pretended it hadn't. The next morning, the sky over Guarulhos was that specific shade of grey that can't decide if it's going to rain or just threaten to all day. Rodrigo opened the shop at 7, booted up the system, checked the orders. The main part had arrived at 9 p.m. the night before, as promised. Nico arrived at 7:15 with bread, coffee, and a theory about the referee from Saturday's game. The part was right. The work could begin. Lucas showed up at 10. Nico was in the shop when he walked in. Rodrigo noticed the moment Nico saw him, noticed the way Nico adjusted his posture. Nothing dramatic, just that fine-tuning men do when they're calibrating the social environment. An observation. Nothing more, but Rodrigo noticed. "Your car is almost done," he told Lucas. "A few more hours." No rush. Lucas looked around with the relaxed curiosity of someone genuinely interested in how things work. "Can I hang around here?" "Waiting room." "Right here is better, if it's not in the way. I hate those blue chairs." Nico let out a laugh. "I don't blame you. They're from when Brazil lost to Italy in '94. Lucas laughed too, the kind of laugh that acknowledges the joke without it needing to be good. "Lucas," he said, extending his hand. "Nico, are you from Guarulhos?" "I am now." And just like that, with the naturalness of a phenomenon that Rodrigo was unable to foresee or intercept, Lucas Ferreira entered Nico Alves's social territory as if there had always been space for him there. Nico asked about his job. Lucas talked about design. Nico said his niece wanted to be a designer and asked if you could make a living out of it. Lucas said it depended on how much uncertainty a person could tolerate. Nico found that amusing. Rodrigo worked. He listened to the conversation from an angle, the way you listen to music while doing something else, present enough to catch it, distant enough not to be a part of it. At 12:30, Nico tapped on the back table. "Lunch, come on you two." The back table was small, 4 people tops, with a plastic tablecloth, 2 wooden benches that had survived Rodrigo's father, and a blender that no one used anymore, but that never went away. Nico had heated up the takeout containers with the practice of someone who had done it 1,000 times, had brought bread, and had split the lunch 3 ways as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Because to Nico, it was. Rodrigo sat down. Lucas sat on the other side. Nico stood for a while, serving, before sitting down as well. It was a normal lunch, normal conversation. Nico talking, Lucas answering, Rodrigo at a diagonal, participating, but from a slightly shifted angle that allowed him to observe without being observed. He observed the way Lucas navigated the table. Nico was the type to test people, not maliciously, just in the natural way of someone who grew up in an environment where social standing is established by whoever doesn't blink. Lucas didn't blink, but not because he was competing. It was because there was simply nothing in him that needed a position. He was sitting at that table, present at that table, without the need to win or lose anything. Rodrigo found this unsettling in a way he couldn't quite name. Then Lucas asked about the scar. It was a long scar, about 4 inches, on the inside of Rodrigo's left forearm. Pale now, almost invisible against his dark skin if you didn't know where to look. Lucas hadn't gone looking for it. He had just seen it when Rodrigo reached out to grab the salt. "Work accident?" Lucas asked, with the neutral tone of someone who asks because they are genuinely interested, not because they want to seem interested. Rodrigo told the story. He was 22. He was working alone on an engine he shouldn't have opened by himself. It was a 2-person job, but the other mechanic had called out, and the client needed the car the next day. The pressure spring had given way wrong, the part had flown out with speed, and he had gotten 11 stitches at the Guarulhos ER while applying pressure with his free hand. "You drove to the hospital," Nico said, recalling the story he had known for years. "I did." "With his arm bleeding," Nico clarified for Lucas. "With my arm bleeding," Rodrigo confirmed. Nico shook his head with the mixture of approval and outrage that always accompanied this story in his version. This man doesn't know how to ask anyone for help. Rodrigo smiled. It was the right way to receive that, the version of the story Nico knew, the one that turned the situation into a test of endurance. Lucas didn't say anything for a second. Rodrigo looked at him, almost without meaning to. Lucas had his eyes on Rodrigo in a calm and direct way, and in them there was something that wasn't admiration, nor judgment, nor curiosity. It was closer to recognition, like someone who heard a story and understood what it said beyond what was being said. "You didn't have to do that alone," Lucas said. Simple, without drama. It was a common phrase. It was the most obvious phrase possible for that situation. Rodrigo had heard variations of it over the years, his mother saying it, his ex saying it, Nico saying it in other words. But this way, in this voice, at that table, it hit differently, like a key that finally finds the right lock. Rodrigo changed the subject. He talked about the engine, about the deadline, about how the afternoon could be heavy if 2 scheduled jobs came in. Nico chimed in with details. Lucas asked a genuine technical question about hydraulic pressure, and the table went on. But Rodrigo carried that phrase for the rest of lunch, and after lunch, and when he went back to the engine at 1:15 with the screw head in his hand and the engine in front of him, the phrase was still there, quiet, in the frequency that grease occupies in the space between your fingers, present even after you think you've washed it off. The problem was this. It wasn't the phrase itself. It was that he had heard variations of it over 24 years. From his mother, from his girlfriend at the time, from Nico, in other words, from his own father in one of their last conversations before he died, on a Saturday morning smelling of burnt coffee and a cold engine. And none of them had landed this way. None had broken through the usual reception mode, the one Rodrigo used when people said things that needed to be heard without actually being received. You tilt your head at the right angle. You say thank you, or that you know, or that you'll think about it. And you go on with what you were doing. Lucas had said the same thing, and it had landed differently. Rodrigo was trying to understand why and wasn't coming to any clean conclusion. Was it the tone? It wasn't. Lucas hadn't said it with any special emphasis. He had said it with the lightness of someone who says something true without needing it to be a big deal. Was it the moment? Maybe the moment had been specific, the story of the scar. Nico turning it into a test of endurance, Rodrigo receiving it as he always did, and then Lucas simply stating what had been said. No guessing games, no taking advantage, with nothing being asked in return. Or it was the person who had said it. Rodrigo didn't want to finish that thought. The screw was in the right position. He tightened it. The part's arrival was confirmed at 2:18 p.m. Rodrigo checked the time when the supplier confirmed, not because he needed to, but because looking at the time was a concrete act in a moment when he needed something concrete. Nico left at 3:30. He had a commitment, team practice, prep for Saturday. The parallel universe Nico maintained with the same energy he put into everything. "Can you finish the Civic?" he asked on his way out. "I can." "Is Lucas still here?" "He is." Nico held his gaze for a second, not in an inquisitorial way, just a silent read. That quick scan that men who have known each other for 20 years do without needing to comment. "All right then, text me when you close up." The shop felt different when Nico left. Not empty. Lucas was in the corner of the waiting room with his laptop, having migrated there after lunch while Rodrigo worked. But different. Quieter, the way spaces get when the social volume drops and what's left is more real. Rodrigo worked on the Civic. The afternoon light came through the opening in the corrugated zinc roof at a low angle, the kind of light that makes metal surfaces look golden for about 20 minutes before it fades. It was a beautiful moment to be in a mechanic shop, if you were the type of person who noticed those things, and Rodrigo usually wasn't, but he was being one right now. Lucas migrated naturally. He didn't announce it, he was simply in the waiting room, and then he was at the entrance to the work area. Then he was closer, looking at the engine with the expression of someone who understands. They don't understand, but finds it interesting anyway. "Can I hang around here?" "Sure." They worked in different modes, Rodrigo with his hands inside the engine, Lucas off to the side with his laptop on a toolbox, looking up from time to time at what was being done and asking questions that showed he was following along. The conversation flowed with that pleasant, discontinuous rhythm of two people who have passed the awkward phase of getting to know each other and reached the point where silence doesn't demand to be filled. At 5:40, Rodrigo closed the hood. "Done." Lucas closed his laptop. "Really? I wanted to double-check one more thing before closing it, but the engine is good, better than when it came in." Lucas came over to the hood, standing next to Rodrigo at an angle that was the same angle from 2 days before, both leaning in, both looking at the same thing, the same setup that had started all of this. The difference was that now there was no part that either of them needed to reach for. Rodrigo felt Lucas's presence like a pressure in the air, not uncomfortable, but present the way atmospheric pressure is present when you start paying attention to it. He was conscious of the distance between them in a way that wasn't usual. A few inches, the smell of grease and metal, and the smell of another person who doesn't smell of grease and metal. Lucas was looking at him. Not at the engine, at him. Rodrigo knew it without needing to check. For a second, a whole second, which was a very long second, neither of them did anything. Then Rodrigo slapped the side of the hood with his palm in a practical and unnecessary gesture and took 2 steps back toward the workbench. "I'll calculate the total," he said, with the voice of someone in work mode because they chose to be in work mode. "It'll take 5 minutes." Lucas stayed where he was for a moment. Then he went to the waiting room. Rodrigo stood with his back to the entrance for an amount of time that wasn't necessary to calculate anything. The workbench had a screw leading nowhere that he kept staring at. The tools on the hook. The calendar featuring a sports car that was 2 months out of date and no one had taken down because no one really paid attention to the calendar. the faint hum of the neon light. He knew that workbench. He knew every tool on that hook. He had grown up in that space, had spent more waking hours in that environment than anywhere else in the world. It was the place where he felt most competent, most secure, most clearly himself. And it was right there, in that space that should be the most concrete in his life, that he had just managed to not do something, and felt the cost of not doing it. The joke had worked. It was a good joke, the kind Rodrigo knew how to make, irreverent, well-timed, breaking the tension with the efficiency of someone who learned that humor is the most versatile tool for managing any situation that requires you not to feel what you're feeling. Lucas had taken a step back without any drama. The moment had been diffused. Rodrigo had deliberately defused the moment. And he stood there staring at the workbench, thinking about Lucas's face after he stepped back. There was no anger on that face. There was no hurt, no withdrawal, no sign of someone who had just lost something. There was only the calm expression of someone who understood what had happened and had chosen not to make a scene about it. That was the hardest part to process. If Lucas had reacted, it would have been simpler. Any reaction would provide the necessary friction for Rodrigo to organize himself in opposition to it. But Lucas had simply backed away, with the same calmness he applied to everything. Without demanding anything, there was something about that non-reaction that weighed heavier than any accusation. He went to calculate the total. Sitting in the chair at the office desk, with the system open and the calculator next to it, and what in practice took 2 minutes, took 6 because there were pauses between steps where Rodrigo kept his eyes on the screen without seeing anything. Parts, labor, additional inspection, manifold, total. He printed the receipt, folded it, went up front. Lucas paid in cash, exact change, with the efficiency of someone who had calculated it beforehand. He grabbed his keys, held out his hand. "It was a pleasure," he said. "The car and the company." Rodrigo shook his hand, firmly, as always. "Any problems with the engine, you come back." "I'm coming back either way." Lucas said it with a tone that wasn't an explicit promise, nor was it indifferent. It was just true, in the way some things are true when the person saying them isn't trying to be anything. He left. Rodrigo stood at the garage door, watching Lucas walk to the Civic in the lot, get in, start it. The engine responded cleanly, without the hum, the fix working, and drive out of the lot slowly, through the gate. Rodrigo stood at the door. He should go inside. He had to close the register, record the payment, text Nico, sweep the back of the garage before leaving because otherwise it piled up, and the next morning it would be worse. He had to set the alarm. He had to wash his hands one last time. There was a lot he should be doing. He stayed at the door until the Civic disappeared around the corner. Then he went inside. The garage after hours was a different place from the garage during business hours. It was the same building, the same light, the same smell, but without the noise of the tools, without the TV, without Nico's voice filling every available corner, the space had a different quality. More honest, perhaps. It had a dense quietness, the kind that demands you lower your volume too, at the risk of seeming ridiculous in the space itself. Rodrigo didn't turn on the TV. He sat on a tall stool near the workbench. He looked at the empty hydraulic lift, the platform at ground level, the metal structure still, no weight being supported at the moment. He thought unintentionally that the lift was the kind of thing you only noticed when there was something on it, or when there wasn't. In both states, weight was the subject. He stayed there. It wasn't in the dramatic way people sit when they realize something. There was no sudden revelation, no light turning on. It was more like what happens when you stop making noise in a room long enough and begin to hear what the room had been saying all along. Nico's laugh. Automatic. The way you laugh at jokes you don't find funny but know are expected of you. The way Rodrigo had learned to do it before doing it consciously, like learning to ride a bike, until the repetition becomes the reflex and the reflex becomes you. His mother's phone call. The same question every Sunday. The answer he gave with the efficiency of someone who had answered it so much that the answer became detached from whatever it was supposed to mean. A girl, she would say, a proper girl. The scar on his arm. 11 stitches by himself because asking for help would be a way of being different from the man he needed to be, in the space that had been set up for him before he even knew what a space was or who was being placed in it. His father, Antonio Santos, who had hands just like Rodrigo's and the same way of walking, and who had built that shop as if building something solid was the only true way to exist. Who had never talked about what it meant to be a man because there was no need to talk. That was it, the shop, the car lifts, the grease, the certainty. Certainty above all. Rodrigo had inherited the certainty along with the building. Or he thought he had inherited it. The unsettling possibility that was opening up in that silent shop, on that stool, under that faintly buzzing neon light, was this: that the certainty had never been inherited. That it had been built, and that built things could be taken apart. It wasn't shame, he checked, and it wasn't shame. It was something closer to vertigo. The feeling of stepping on a floor you thought was concrete and discovering it was just a pattern painted on thin air. 34 years old. 6 months since a relationship ended without him feeling the pain he was supposed to feel. A lifetime of hands clean of anything that wasn't mechanical. And 2 days with a man who existed in a way Rodrigo didn't know was possible to exist. Relaxed in his own skin, present in his own eyes, without a script to follow. And that low-frequency discomfort he had carried since time immemorial suddenly had a name trying to form at the edge of his consciousness. He didn't form the name. But he stayed at the shop longer than necessary, sitting on the stool facing the empty lift with his hands resting still on his knees. He thought about his father. Not with the anger he would need to feel if his father had been a villain. Antonio Santos wasn't a villain. He was a man of his time, in a world of his own, who had built the best he knew how. The problem with inheritances wasn't intention. It was the weight. The weight you carry without knowing it's a weight because you grew up inside it. Rodrigo stayed quiet for a long time, and in the midst of that silence emerged a question he had never formulated into words. Not about Lucas. It wasn't about Lucas. It predated Lucas. It was the question that Lucas had merely made impossible to keep avoiding. There was a 30-year-old man who worked from wherever he wanted, who had deliberately chosen where to live, who was completely comfortable during lunch with Nico and during an afternoon in a stranger's auto shop, and in a conversation that went deeper than conversations usually went. A man who existed without the weight of an identity that required constant vigilance, who didn't need to laugh the right way or speak the right way or be the person the room expected him to be. Rodrigo had found that unsettling. And he had been unsettled for 2 days before admitting to himself that the unsettlement wasn't rejection. It was recognition. Recognition of what? That was the part that still lacked words. But the mirror was right there, and what the mirror showed was a 34-year-old man who had built a highly efficient version of himself and had inhabited that version with such consistency that he had forgotten, somewhere along the way, that the version and the person were not the same thing. He scanned his own chest one more time, searching for guilt, but there was none. It was astonishment. The quiet and devastating astonishment of finding a room in your own house that you didn't know existed. Rodrigo stayed quiet for even longer. Then he closed up the shop. The next morning arrived with the same shade of grey in the Guarulhos sky, now holding more of a promise of rain than the day before. Rodrigo opened at 7 as usual. Nico at 7:15. An early tune-up job, a battery that needed replacing, the rhythm of a Wednesday that was no different from his own rhythm. At 8:46, the silver Civic pulled into the lot. Rodrigo was in the back of the shop when he heard the engine. Clean now, without the hum that had arrived 2 days prior. He recognized the sound of his own fix. He stayed where he was. Lucas pulled into the lot and got out of the car with his backpack slung over his shoulder. Not in a rush. He walked up to the entrance with that same relaxed demeanor as always, meeting Rodrigo's eyes in the dim light of the shop. "I forgot my laptop charger in the waiting room yesterday," Lucas said. "I noticed this morning when I went to work." Rodrigo went to the waiting room. The charger was in the corner outlet, exactly where Lucas had sat. He unplugged it, walked back over to Lucas, and handed it to him. "Thanks." Lucas took the charger. He stood there for a moment holding it, like someone who had completed a movement but still hadn't chosen the next one. In the back, Nico was absorbed in listening to a live broadcast of something on his phone. The shop had the faint noise of the day getting started. "The car responded well," Lucas said. "The difference is considerable. An engine in good shape does that." Lucas nodded. Then he looked at Rodrigo in a direct way. Not the look that evaluates, not the one that challenges, but that specific kind of look that belongs to someone who simply sees you and isn't trying to do anything with it other than see. "If you want to grab that beer again," Lucas said, "you know where to find me." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't an invitation loaded with unspoken things. It was exactly what it seemed to be. Someone saying he had enjoyed a conversation and was available for another. Simple, without an agenda. "Let me get your contact," Rodrigo said. He grabbed his phone. Lucas dictated the number. Rodrigo saved it. Lucas went to the car, opened the door, got in. The engine started up clean. Rodrigo stood at the entrance of the auto shop watching the Civic back up, pull out the gate, and turn into the street. The sound was different now, clean, calibrated, without the humming that had announced Lucas 2 days earlier. It was the difference between a broken engine and the same engine running smoothly, and Rodrigo had made that difference with his own hands. And usually that was enough. It was enough to be the reason things worked. This time, there was another difference too. Every other day, when Rodrigo had watched a customer leave the lot, he'd felt the simple satisfaction of a completed transaction. Service rendered, car delivered, payment received, next. It was a clean conclusion. That was the kind of thing Rodrigo liked. Clean conclusions. This time the Civic pulled out the gate, and Rodrigo felt the exact opposite of a conclusion. It put its left blinker on. It stopped at the corner traffic light, a light that stayed red for an irritatingly long time when you were waiting. Rodrigo kept staring at the Civic stopped at the red light. He thought about what Lucas had said at the back table, about the scar. You didn't have to do it alone. He thought about his mother's voice, the same question every week, and the automatic answer that slipped out before anything more truthful could surface. He thought about Nico, the brother life had given him, who was also the most visible embodiment of the world Rodrigo had learned to occupy. He thought about the empty tow truck. He thought about the automatic laugh, about the file that kept reopening, about the grease smudge on Lucas's forearm that Lucas had spent all day without noticing, the small, persistent mark of a single second that had started all this. He thought of a man who had driven himself to the hospital with 11 stitches in his arm and who, when people framed it as a display of strength, smiled the way he was expected to smile, and who had learned to smile that way so well that he had forgotten at some point that there was another way to receive a story about not asking for help. A way that said, not that you were strong, but that you didn't have to carry it by yourself. The light was going to turn green, the Civic was going to drive away, and Rodrigo had a full day of jobs ahead. A battery to install, a half-finished inspection, Nico waiting in the back with a game broadcast playing on his phone. He had everything he always had. The light was still red. Rodrigo shoved the rag into his back pocket. He turned back toward the inside of the shop. He stopped. The right thing to do would be to go inside. The right thing, according to every grading system he had used his entire life, was to go inside, finish the day, close the register, and leave. That was the right move. It was the move the version of himself he'd built over 34 years would make without hesitation. He stood still with his back to the street for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Then he turned around. "Nico," he said, loud enough to reach the back. "I'll be right back." He didn't wait for an answer. He grabbed his keys, walked out the entrance, and crossed the sidewalk right as the light turned green. But the Civic hadn't moved. A truck stopped in the intersection was blocking the way, keeping the car in line. Rodrigo was on the sidewalk. Lucas was inside. Lucas saw Rodrigo. Rodrigo walked up to the car window. Lucas rolled it down. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The truck began to move. The line behind the Civic was waiting. The world was in its usual rush. And then Rodrigo said something. I won't record exactly what he said here, because some things belong to the people who live them. What matters is that it was the first true thing Rodrigo Santos had said about himself in a long time, perhaps the first time he'd said out loud, something that had been there for far longer than he was willing to admit. Lucas listened without moving, not with surprise, more with the expression of someone who had been waiting without knowing they were waiting, and who suddenly realizes the wait is over. He didn't say, I knew it. He didn't say anything that made it about him. What he said was for Rodrigo, something quiet and direct, the way Lucas said everything. The truck was gone. The light was green. The cars behind the Civic waited. Lucas put his blinker on and pulled out of line. He parked in the gas station lot just ahead. Rodrigo crossed the street. What passed between them after that, the words, the time, what that moment became, belongs to them. What belongs to this story is what Rodrigo felt in his body the moment he crossed that street. It wasn't relief, or it wasn't just relief. It was closer to something clicking into place after being out of place for a long time. The absence of an ache he didn't even know he was carrying. The choice to be, for the first time, the man who didn't have to drive himself to the hospital. There are moments in life that divide everything into before and after. This one doesn't show up as a big dramatic scene. There's no swelling music or slow motion or the absolute certainty that you're doing the right thing. It shows up as an ordinary Tuesday, as a car with a noisy engine, as two hands reaching for the same part at the same time, and then as the choice, tiny and enormous, not to pull back the second time. If you recognized anything in this story, in the automatic laugh that slipped out before you could choose, in the low-frequency hum you carry without a name, then you already know what it was saying. That the question is valid, that the discomfort isn't a flaw, that we don't have to carry the weight of the certainties we inherited all by ourselves. If this resonated with you, hit subscribe. Every week, stories like this, about what it means to be honest with yourself, about what it costs and what it sets free. You're not alone on this journey. See you in the next one.